And welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Kiku Huckle. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science at Pace University, and I will be working to moderate this panel, bringing research to bear on the needs of Catholic institutions and the migrant populations that they serve. So the intention of this panel is to bridge the gap that we often see between research and service providers within Catholic institutions. Each of these two groups tends to be ensconced in their own arenas with not as much overlap as we would generally like to see. So Catholic institutions, being service providers, are really good with people, and service providers are working to respond to the needs that they see within their own unique communities. And unfortunately, sometimes these service providers are lacking the information that they need to determine, one, just the extent of the population that they're working to serve, two, to analyze whether or not their programs are as effective as they could be, and then three, data for understanding how they could potentially reach a wider swath of people with the limited resources that they have available. On the other side, we have researchers who are trained to analyze data. We can identify patterns in behavior, find relationships between communities and events, analyze the effectiveness of solutions to problems, and things of that nature. Unfortunately, for a lot of us researchers, sometimes our analyses lack the appropriate context. We don't know which questions would actually be most useful to Catholic institutions and other service providers, particularly those who are serving migrant and refugee populations. Researchers also oftentimes lack access to information, access to institutions, access to people to talk about, to try to understand what those needs and those more appropriate questions might be. So for this panel, one of our goals is to bring together the needs of institutions with the skills of researchers, and this is also a larger goal of CMS, broadly speaking. And in doing this, we acknowledge the importance of cultivating relationships between researchers, institutions, and service providers in order to advance the work in service of migrant populations. So today we have a group of esteemed panelists who are each going to share their experiences and perspectives on research in the context of working within very distinct institutions, very distinct Catholic institutions. First, we have Msgr Robert Vitillo, who is a Secretary General of the International Catholic Migration Commission and attaché for the permanent mission of the Holy See to the UN in Geneva. We also have Dr. Ricardo Martinez-Schuldt, who is an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Notre Dame. And last but not least, Dr. Mike Nicholson, who is our valued researcher at the Center for Migration Studies. So they are each going to open with just a few brief comments about the importance of research to migrant serving institutions from each of their unique perspectives. After that, I'll start the conversation with a few questions for each of our panelists, and then hopefully we can shift into more of a conversation driven by questions from you who are joining us today, who are, we hope, are participants and not just viewers. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Msgr.
Sorry, the microphone was not on. Thank you for the invitation, and really thanks a lot to Center for Migration Studies for this excellent conference that they've been sponsoring, and also to Notre Dame University. I think the research is very, very important to our institutions, the Catholic Church institutions. They're actually the service institutions. First of all, it's important for us to have objective data to be able to help inform our own areas of intervention and our strategies. But also it's important to show others the evidence that we have in terms of what we actually do. I often am asked by people at the United Nations, they know the church is very involved in humanitarian assistance of all different types, but they'll say to me, we know you do a lot, but we don't really know what you really do and what kind of an impact there is. And so I see the research as helping us to inform that and to show the actual success as well as the challenges that we face as Catholic organizations.
Thank you. Ricardo, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Huckle, for the introduction. As you had mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame. So much of my work with regards to immigrant populations or the effects of immigrant related policy on the lived experiences of immigrants has really been academic in nature. And by that, what I mean is that my work has really been dedicated to testing and refining theories in an effort to just kind of produce a better understanding of how the social world operates. Still, I want to emphasize today's theme regarding the importance of collaborations between academics and think tanks and Catholic institutions. And it's not just because I think, me as a academic has a lot to offer in terms of my research expertise, but I do think that Catholic institutions have a lot to offer us as well. And I don't mean that Catholic institutions can just facilitate access to populations of interest. I think that it is pretty clear that the people that actually make up Catholic institutions, the service providers, they have a lot to offer us in terms of unique insight, and that's insight that is developed through face-to-face interactions with actual members of immigrant populations. And I think that insight can be very beneficial to push us to think beyond our kind of pre-existing ideas of how people's lives are structured or organized or constrained by social context.
Great, thank you. And Mike.
So my name is Mike Nicholson. I'm a researcher at the Center for Migration Studies. And here at CMS, we collaborate very closely with various Catholic agencies. And we design much of our research with the goals of these agencies in mind. We rely on them quite heavily to understand what issues are pressing, what research they need, and how we can help them better serve their the clients and the immigrants that they work with. So some of the points that I'll be making throughout this presentation involve that, or I want to emphasize that our research, or we view research at CMS as having several goals. First, research can help Catholic agencies better target their services to reach vulnerable populations. Research can also help Catholic organizations' advocacy efforts. And then research can help Catholic agencies educate the public about immigrants' contribution to the communities. And it's also very important to pro-immigrant messaging to help people understand what migrants' contributions are and to increase support and advocacy for migrants within parishes and within the broader Catholic community. Research can also help church officials better understand the challenges facing Catholic institutions like parishes, schools, etc.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with a couple of questions for the three of you. And Ricardo, I actually have a directed question for you first. How would you say, just as we're trying to make really clear this connection between research and service providers, how would you say that research and empirical evidence can improve or facilitate the work that is currently being done to serve migrant populations?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for us to think about kind of two types or two forms of academic research, and that's qualitative research and quantitative research. And obviously these two paradigms or these two approaches encompass different specific methodologies. These are very broad kind of categorizations of types of research, quantitative research, qualitative research. But I think there are some unifying themes or goals of these two approaches to research. So quantitative researchers, like myself, we typically rely on quantitative statistical methods to analyze data sets that contain information on people or aggregate units of analysis, such as cities or counties. And our goals are often to try to demonstrate that there are systematic patterns in the lived experiences of peoples, or demonstrate that there are systematic differences in how social processes play out, right? It goes beyond just, drawing on anecdotes to say that this is how people's lives are structured. We try to, draw on empirical evidence to demonstrate that that's the case. So I think there was this recent study actually by a sociologist that analyzed a nationally representative survey of Latinos and Asian immigrants. And the purpose of the study was to just kind of show what immigrants' experiences were with kind of acculturated stressors in the United States. So this researcher was able to draw on this nationally representative sample to show that one, these groups kind of systematically experience adverse stressors once they come to the United States, and also show that Latino and Asian immigrants kind of have different rates of negative stressors. So they showed that Asian immigrants were more likely to report experiencing language-based discrimination. Latino immigrants were more likely to report experiencing stress related to their immigration status. So that's kind of an important component of quantitative research, kind of demonstrating that these systematic patterns exist. Beyond that, though, I think kind of maybe a second and arguably more important goal in my mind is that quantitative research can try to establish that causal relationships exist amongst variables of interest. So in that same study I had referenced, the researcher was able to show that migrants that had experienced pre-migration trauma, which includes being a victim of crime, undergoing a natural disaster in their country of origin, these adverse pre-migration experiences were causally related to post-migration stressors. So post-migration experiences of feeling isolated, of experiencing discrimination, and that sort of thing. So in contrast to, I think, quantitative research, or if we can talk quickly about qualitative research typically employs in-depth interviews, participant observation, ethnographic studies to really try to cultivate rich information on people's lives. So an analysis of a qualitative research typically helps us as quantitative researchers understand kind of the underlying mechanisms that are kind of playing out in these causal processes that we identify. So we could envision a qualitative project that would do kind of a follow-up survey or in-depth interview with migrants that had experienced both pre and post-migration forms of trauma to kind of better understand what that underlying connection is, right? Why is it that we find this correlation or this causal effect of pre-migration trauma on negative stressors upon or after migration? And we would think that such a qualitative study would really help us try to develop maybe an intervention program or a treatment program to either help migrants avoid or cope with stressful events upon migrating, right? And then in turn, a quantitative project might be used to actually test the efficacy of different intervention or different treatment programs.
Thank you. And so that actually leads in really well to a question that I have for you, Mike. So when we're talking about research and these interesting questions and systemic patterns that we can identify, this is purely from a research perspective, right? And so Mike, can you talk a little bit more, you had started to do this in your introduction, but some of the perhaps less intuitive ways or more direct ways that our research can help Catholic agencies?
Yeah, so we often, at CMS, we often see our research supporting advocacy by Catholic agencies, a wide variety of Catholic agencies, particularly Clinic Catholic Legal Immigration Network. Agencies regularly cite our research, particularly estimates we make of vulnerable populations, as well as populations that are affected by certain policies like public charge. So we aim to have our research cited in public comments that they make on the proposed regulations in the Federal Register. Our work has been cited, for example, in letters to the government by Catholic agencies. It has been cited in congressional reports. We often design our research so that in close collaboration with Catholic agencies with the aim that they will use our numbers and our projections in their comments and communications. So some examples include Clinic used some estimates we produced on the Liberian Refugee and Immigration Fairness Act in letters that they wrote to the USCIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Services. Several organizations also cited CMS research in advocacy and comments on proposed fee increases, naturalization fee increases that have been proposed by the Trump administration. So it's very important. I mean, these comments often they're read by the government. They're an important way to impact federal rulemaking. So that's an important way that research can weigh on and bear on policies as they're shaped. Research can also help Catholic agencies educate the public about immigrants' contribution to the communities. For example, we recently published several several papers on essential workers with estimates of we estimated, for example, that 19.8 million essential workers in the US, or 19.8 million immigrants are essential workers in the US, and immigrants work in essential critical infrastructure occupations as defined by the Department of Homeland Security at a higher rate than natives. So this work has been picked up by various Catholic agencies. It's been utilized by Catholic agencies, and it's been of great interest to advocates more generally as they seek to inform their communities about the positive contributions that immigrants are making, and particularly, that immigrants are they're on the front lines in many cases fighting COVID, keeping us safe, keeping us healthy, keeping us fed, at great risk to themselves. They at the same time, undocumented immigrants are still, vulnerable to arrest, deportation, and lack the resource, or lack support from the federal government in terms of CARES Act and stimulus packages. So, our reports have really highlighted this, and I think they've been effective tools at informing through which agencies can inform their constituencies, can inform their communities about the positive impact of immigration. Likewise, we produced a study on the effect of deportation on parishes and communities that's been widely cited, and we worked very closely with the Kino Border Initiative on that project. We conducted interviews with the families and communities of deportees in several parishes across the country, and that's been, an important tool for Catholic agencies to really understand the impact that deportation has had on their communities. We also, some of our research helps church officials better understand the challenges facing parishes and schools in these difficult times. For example, we have an annual survey of Catholic immigrant serving agencies. We conducted our first survey of this nature last year, and we're conducting one this year starting shortly after this conference. So many of you will receive emails of that looking forward. And the purpose of this is to gauge what challenges and what obstacles Catholic agencies are facing, and particularly during the pandemic, in accessing and serving the most vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable immigrants in their communities. So, this type of research can inform dioceses about the problems the challenges that individual schools and parishes are facing, and can inform church officials more broadly, such as the USCCB, about general patterns general challenges that Catholic institutions throughout the country are facing.
Fantastic, thank you. And then lastly, I have a question for you, Monsignor, more of a direct application. How have you specifically used research in your past and present work in response to migrant populations?
Okay, we've done quite a bit of research in the past, even before I arrived at Icmc 4 years ago. I've worked in the research area on other things with Caritas Internationalis. But for Icmc, we usually have some interns come to work with us on some of the research questions we want to look at. Icmc actually convenes civil society on the implementation of the international compact, the global compact on migration, and also we have some of those same convening responsibilities around implementing the global compact on refugees. And we also convene civil society for the Global Forum for Migration and Development every year. So we usually ask these interns to help us to look at certain questions that we want to feed into the rest of civil society in terms of stands that they might take, especially with the Global Forum for Migration and Development. It's a kind of a joint conference every year where governments meet with each other, civil society meets with each other, and then there's a joint dialogue day or day and a half for them to talk to each other. And so a lot of the research questions that our interns are doing help us to inform the others about what kinds of policies we might want to push forward with the governments. Quite some time ago, we did a research study on in Lebanon on the impact of refugee situations on older refugees, and that we did with the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. And we were able to show this was partly qualitative, partly quantitative, but that a good number of the older refugees, first of all, often gave their food to their grandchildren, and so they were not being nourished properly. A lot of them didn't get the prescriptions filled because they knew that the families needed the money, so they didn't want to spend any money on themselves. And many of them had a sense that they really were not worthwhile, even in cultures where older people are very much respected and held honored. So this was information that helped us then work with the older refugees. We did that also in collaboration with Caritas Lebanon, that was doing a lot of service with the refugees at that point in time and still does. More recently, we've been involved now for the past 2 years on doing research on the impact of migration on work and workers. And this has been a 2-year project that was funded by a Catholic foundation from Germany. It's part of a much larger project that's called The Future of Work, Labor After Laudato Si, showing the Laudato Si approach to integral human development. And for our part of it, the impact on work and workers, we've worked very closely with the Center for Migration Study in New York, and then also its affiliates in Manila and in Cape Town, South Africa. And there we wanted to look for Cape Town. They looked for us with the impact of migration on so many of the migrants who are coming from other African countries, many times not English speaking in a main English speaking country of South Africa, but also then they have Afrikaans and many of the African languages. But these were people who couldn't communicate so well in South Africa, and yet they needed the work, and they were many times in very precarious positions and unsafe positions, and often in slave-like conditions. So the center in South Africa studied those situations, and we've now put together a report on that research, as well as on with the Migration Center, Study Center in Manila, did 2 projects for us. One was to look at the situation of Taiwanese, Vietnamese, and Indonesian fisher people on the big ships in Taiwan, and showed that there was really a 2-way situation. Some who had been hired as in the domestic program had a lot more protection from the Taiwanese government, but those on the big ships that were farther out at sea had very little protection and really were in very, very, very poor conditions. So that has been reported. Both the Center for in South Africa and in Manila have published these studies, but now we're putting it all together into an integrated report. And the second project that the Manila Center did was to look at the potential of sustainable agricultural programs to help people remain, young people remain in the Philippines and not have to go out if they didn't want to. And again, there were some very positive results they had when modern farming methods, when shared modern equipment was put into place in those areas, and also helping the young people see that this is a profession and they could do it in a professional way and succeed with it. Finally, we had the center in New York do a summary of Catholic social teaching with a special focus on Laudato Si and the values that shaped for our project, and then also summarize the major findings of all 3 of those studies, as well as a number of secondary studies that we did and good practice identifications throughout the world. In addition to that, we did a photojournalism project where we sent a photographer to India, to Cote d'Ivoire, and then to US and Mexico to do photos of the people as people, not as issues. and also get their testimonies. And so for that, we're integrating those testimonies into our report on the research itself. And we're also doing a separate photojournalism book with all of the testimonies and the photos.
Well, I'm excited to see the photos in the book. So there is, so there's a question from one of our participants. How do you make your research understandable to policymakers and the broader public, indicating smart people, but who don't have a background in research methods? And before I ask for an answer from our panelists, I actually want to pose a question to the participants as well. And that would be, how can we as researchers make this information more accessible to you? How, for you as service providers, do you envision this bridge coming through, granting more access, or how can we as researchers make this available more accessible? How can we centralize a place for you to look for this type of help beyond just the Center for Migration Studies if you're already a larger institution like Clinic? So just for the participants, if you could think about that, we would love to hear your feedback and your suggestions. So from the researcher side, how do we work to make our research understandable to policymakers and the public? Mike, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Sure. I mean, I think critically, we try to disseminate our research in a manner that's easily digestible by, for example, summarizing our key results right up front at the beginning of the at the beginning of each report, and sort of brief bullet points that get our main points across. We also have we've been organizing increasingly throughout COVID webinars that sort of disseminate our research, in which we'll discuss, our main findings for 10 minutes or so. Each person from CMS will sort of cover a different aspect of our report. We've been doing this with our essential workers reports briefly, and then open it up for questions. And I think that's a really good way to sort of understand, to help the public understand these reports and our research, but also it gives feedback to us about how we can make our research more accessible in the future. And in terms of as we collect people's questions and get feedback from webinars, it's very useful to us as we move forward with our other research projects. And I mean, I think that we also have a pretty rigorous internal editing process, and we keep our readers in mind, as we're editing, trying to make it our documents as user-friendly as possible. But it's always a work in progress. So I mean, I'd like to hear from participants here, I mean, about how we can make our research more accessible to you as well.
Great, thank you. And Ricardo, I'm going to pick on you as a fellow academic. We are often accused of living in an ivory white tower, and we write these 25, 30-page treaties in journals that only fellow academics read. So how would you say researchers such as ourselves in academic institutions can make what we do and what we write more understandable and more public-facing?
I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that unfortunately in academia, there is not an incentive necessarily, especially at research institutions like Notre Dame, there's no incentive or reward structure to push us to make our research accessible to the general public, right? Exactly like Dr. Huckle described, we're often writing to and for other academics. That said, me and I think the reality is most academics study topics that are very meaningful to them and that they're very passionate about. So I know me and some of my colleagues in the research projects that I've worked on, we have gone out of our way to do things like write op-eds in online media sources. We've worked with journalists at the Washington Post, the New York Times, to have our work summarized in a way or presented in a way that is more easily digestible. In terms of trying to hopefully make our research more understandable for policymakers, again, me and my colleagues have actually met with, in the past we met with Customs and Border Protections to we met with the head of CBP basically to talk about some of the issues that were occurring along the border with regards to migrant abuse. We've met with other government agencies to kind of try to present our research in a more practical way and explain kind of some of the implications of what we see for our research. In addition to that, I haven't done this, but one of my collaborators has done a lot to take part as a ad hoc congressional do an ad hoc congressional testimony in front of Congress. He's also done a number of panel sessions for congressional aides. And again, the hope there is that he just, shows up and talks to congressional aides or Congress members about kind of the work that we've been doing and the implications of that work. So I think in addition to, working with journalists or coining our own op-ed pieces, I think there's a lot of work being done in terms of showing up to these congressional hearings and advocating on behalf of these populations that we study.
Great, thank you. And Msgr, do you have something to say on this as well?
Yes, I do. Actually, I've been involved in a very interesting initiative around this. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Vatican set up a COVID commission, and the Pope has been very much urging people in the world not to think about going back to the old normal, but to look at the gaps that we have economically, socially, medically, access to health and education, and to try to find a way to transform the world, again, in the light of his own encyclical of Laudato Si. So I was asked to serve on this, on the economy task force of this, this commission. And there were a number of think tanks, a lot of experts, far more expert than I on this thing. But I was asked to coordinate an approach of preparing briefing papers on the impact on work and workers. And so I used a lot of the data that was being generated by think tanks. I also consulted the CMS articles and things too, but also by ILO, by the UN agencies as well. And each week we produced a briefing paper on a different aspect. First, it was around general impact on immigrants and migrants. Then it was on the internal migrant workers. It was on a special impact on women, on essential health workers, on the gaps in the supply chains. And in that, we looked at the first thing was, it was the old look, judge, and act thing. So we did at the looking, the statistics, and then we judged according to the lens of Catholic social teaching. And then we suggested action for the Holy See, for the Pope, for bishops, for people throughout the world, both the Christian believers as well as people of goodwill. And so that required a real translation from the data, the things that we rely on people like you to generate, to try to phrase it in a way, especially that the Catholic hierarchy could understand, because they have a great deal of impact on people, but they wouldn't be able to simply state it the way the researchers reported it. And so we tried to do that bridge languaging. And then a great deal of that was used in the Pope's messages during the past few months, and especially during the month of August. He focused on COVID during all of his messages each week during his public audience. And a lot of those themes that we had looked at were incorporated into his catechetical teachings.
Great, thank you. So I have a question here. In today's day and age, some people ignore the facts in favor of baseless, I believe statements. How do you talk about your research with people who have that attitudes, or do you try to share your findings with them? I will leave this up to the three of you if any of you would like to jump in first.
I'll jump in if you don't mind. Certainly, I know those statements and hear them a lot, even at the UN from some of the government representatives. But I think that's also why it's so important for us to have the background, the data, the evidence, the impact. And also, I find from a lot of the government representatives that they're impressed that we're out in the field, because at the UN you hear a lot of very abstract declarations. Many times even the ambassadors of the countries that they represent don't know the situation in those very countries. But I could come and say, well, we're engaged in that country and this is what's happening, and this is what we find, and this is how we respond to it. So I think it is important for us to shape our messaging on the evidence, but then also to have the credibility because we're actually involved in the field.
I'll answer that too. I mean, you know, obviously one of the biggest challenges that we face, and I think all researchers face, is that, you know, our work tends to be read most by the people who agree with the points we're trying to make already, or that share a pro-immigrant viewpoint. But I think that that's something that we try to do at CMS, and that, you know, we think other organizations probably do as well, is at least, you know, work closely with Catholic agencies who are working in advocacy on the ground, and folks at parishes who understand the concerns of their parishioners and understand the concerns of people in their communities, so that we can better address those through research and disseminate research that that Catholic agencies can use that speaks more directly to the audiences, that the communities that they work with, than we might otherwise without such collaborations. You know, so I want to emphasize that these collaborations are also very valuable from that perspective, that it allows that the collaboration can improve messaging potentially, and make messaging, pro-immigrant messaging using research, more effective in addressing the concerns of people who might not, you know, who might be skeptical of immigration's benefits.
I also have a response for that one. I think what I found to be most effective is when you're talking about topics that are incredibly contentious, and you have two very, very entrenched sides, and sometimes there's more than two very entrenched sides. If you find a common normative value or a common belief, and then you shape your argument around that, that tends to be the most effective. So, or if I disagree with if somebody is worried about immigration because they're worried about the economics of it because they can't feed their family, you have no way of telling this individual that your inability to feed your family is an invalid concern, right? It is a very, very valid concern. So let me explain to you, because this is what's important, how immigrants actually benefit the economic prospect of your being able to feed your family. And so you can use the data, the information, to answer the concerns that people actually have. And so when you have a conversation based on I believe, kind of drill down and figure out, well, what is the value or the fear that is driving those statements, and talk directly to that. That's a little bit easier, well, not easier, theoretically should be easier, I think, for Catholic conversations, because we do have a common theology that is not present when, as Catholic researchers, we talk to especially, like, I'm in political science, so political science is very, very secular, so there's not a shared value. So there should be this shared Catholic theology between researchers and immigrant service providers, or migrant service providers, I should say. And so if sometimes it just requires a reframe or a re-understanding. So reframe, like Msgr, you were saying, about those values and what are the facts behind an interpretation of a theological belief that we share. Let's see. For Msgr, is Icmc's research tied in with the UN Social Development Goals? And if so, how?
Well, yes. First of all, as I said, the latest research we were doing on the future of work was closely tied to the Pope's Laudato Si encyclical, which is integral human development. So, I'd like to think that in a lot of ways, the Catholic social teaching predated the UN's social development goals, but certainly there's a lot of consistency in it, except in certain places where some ideology has entered in to those development goals, or at least to some of the objectives that they want to accomplish. So I think there's a lot that's very similar that we're working on at the same time, and in fact in the research reports that we're doing, both on the labor migration, but also on the wider labor issues, we have several references back to the UN Social Development Goals.
Great, thank you. There's another question here. I'm going to reframe it a little bit, but I'll read it as it is first. When you do qualitative research, and especially interviews, how do you establish trust with immigrants and refugees? And I'm actually going to broaden that a little bit because I think this is an issue for all researchers, regardless of whether we're doing qualitative research and interviews or quantitative research, because oftentimes it's difficult to establish that trust and relationship with institutions and service providers, even if it's something like the survey that Mike, you were just talking about that CMS sends out. Ricardo, would you try to take a first stab at answering this question about establishing trust?
Yeah, sure. So to be honest, I do mostly quantitative work, as I had mentioned. So much of my research involves me sitting in my office, downloading data sets, or trying to find and put together data sets that are available on different processes that I'm interested in. That being said, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my friends do quite a bit of qualitative research. So I think from what I've seen, I think one way that people try to establish trust with immigrants is by really embedding themselves in their community of interest. Oftentimes, I think what actually ends up happening is people are first and foremost members of some specific community, and it's through their involvement with those communities that they start to develop research ideas. And from that, you're already kind of a natural member of that community, so people tend to trust you and that sort of thing. However, I have had colleagues do things like, I had a colleague that was interested in understanding the experiences of migrant workers in meatpacking facilities. So as part of her dissertation, she went and got a job as a graduate student. She got a job at a meatpacking facility, and she worked at the meatpacking facility as a graduate student for a year. So she worked right alongside immigrants, and was able to develop informal relationships with her coworkers, and through that was able to kind of create the network through which she was able to then select people and interview people as part of her project. Another colleague of mine, as part of her dissertation, actually picked up and moved to a apartment complex that was a facility that was primarily housing refugees and immigrant community members, and she just lived in that apartment complex for a year. Did her laundry, with her community members, shopped at the same grocery stores, went to church with these people. So it became a fixture of the community, and again, first and foremost, developed kind of these informal social connections that then opened up the doors for the interviews.
Mike, do you have something?
Yeah, so we've worked with a lot of populations that have been extremely vulnerable. For example, stateless populations and undocumented populations that, it can be difficult to access them in the same way that you might be able to access other immigrant communities. So in my experience, it's been very important to win the trust of gatekeepers for these communities. So community-based organizations that can put you in touch with these immigrants and maybe give you opportunities to talk to them in order to earn their trust. Or you can talk to the gatekeepers as well and discuss the project, show them questionnaires in advance. And often, so in a project that we're currently working on, for example, we're conducting interviews of immigrants in different communities in New York City. And we worked through state officials and with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to put us in touch with immigrant leaders who are then, or leaders of community-based organizations that work closely with immigrants, who are then putting us in touch with immigrants for interviews. So I think that working with people who are already in close contact with immigrants and getting an opportunity to speak to them and perhaps speak to the immigrants directly about the research is very important. I've also found that, you know, in larger projects, if you're conducting sort of, you know, a large number of interviews or a large number of surveys, and it's helpful to hire people or hire volunteers that are directly from immigrant communities themselves, that understand not only the problems and challenges that people face, but also are fluent in the languages that immigrants speak. I mean, that's been particularly helpful, I think, in prior work that we've and work that I'm conducting now that involves Muslim communities and Arabic-speaking immigrant communities as well, because it can be, you know, very difficult to break into some. I mean, not just them, but it can be very difficult to break into many different communities. And the more you can find people that have a shared background, shared experiences, I think the easier it is to get through to interviewees and survey respondents.
Monsignor, you're in a unique position as far as access to communities and institutions. So do you have an answer or suggestions given your unique perspective?
Well, I guess one of the suggestions is similar to what Mike just said. I think you've got to get to the people who are working with them. And many times I have to say, it's hard to convince even our own staff you know, of giving that kind of access. They're very protective, and that's for a good reason. But I think they have to also get to know who you are and where you're coming from and what your motivation is. And then also take their clues, you know, try to develop the relationships with them, show them how you could help them do their work, as well as that you're going to be deeply respectful of the people that they're trying to protect and they're trying to assist. And that's it's a hard sell sometimes. Also, that's the point that, you know, they're working very hard, especially if they're involved in humanitarian assistance. So they don't see, you know, right now, how can I take time with you to help you do your job when then in a way they feel like they're taking away the attention from the people that they should be working with every single day, every hour of their workday, and beyond that, those work days. So I think, again, it's trying to help them see how they could benefit from this and that you could be trusted.
Great, thank you. So Monsignor, you already touched on this, but there is a question about COVID-19. Of course, it's a big issue on everybody's mind right now. So what new research questions do we have, and what do we hope to know about this unprecedented time?
Well, I'll just share with you some of the things that we continue to reflect on in terms of the impact on work. And of course, many of those workers, as Mike said, the essential workers are immigrants themselves for the most part, and refugees. So a few things then. We've been having an ongoing group that meets every week to go over the reports that we've worked on to move forward with them. And then we've convened a number of webinars. We've been working a lot with Georgetown University on this as well. And we've invited CMS, but I don't know if they've been able to join some of that. And certainly we'd like to see you join it because we've, you know, we see a great deal more that we have to look at in terms of, first of all, the inequalities. You know, we know that they're there, but how can we find a way, as the Pope says, to transform the world? And how can we find the way to put greater emphasis on those in the peripheries than we put on ourselves, basically, especially because all of us are vulnerable to this pandemic. We're very, very interested in looking more on the impact on education. And I don't need to tell you that because you're involved in the education, but you know, what's it going to look like in the future? And also then how do we make sure that we include those people who don't have access to the modern means of communication and internet and things like that? We're also looking again at the situation of women and what special vulnerabilities they have, in addition to the fact that they're a big part of the core of essential workers, but also what other vulnerabilities do they have, and how do we change the world and the relationships between women and men, boys and girls, that we can reduce those inequalities and those vulnerabilities. We're also interested in the whole area of again, access to whatever medicines and vaccines that get developed, and make sure there's really access. And so we've been discussing with some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers on that, and also some of the diagnostics manufacturers on how to make sure that these new tests, these new medicines, and eventually a vaccine will really be available to everyone. And Pope Francis has spoken about this many, many times in his meetings with heads of state, but also publicly during the Angelus blessings and during his weekly audiences, and as he meets with specific groups of people who could be instrumental in making policies around this.
Mike or Ricardo, do you have a response to the COVID-19 question?
So actually, I'm not planning any future migration-related research with regards to COVID. I have some other projects related to crime and that sort of thing, but nothing related to migration.
So CMS has a COVID and migration resources page where we've been posting interesting articles and developments related to COVID as it pertains to its impact on migrants, and also, how, in particular, lately we've been focused on how COVID is impacting migrants in detention centers, as well as how states and local officials have been sort of chipping in to help migrants who were not able to access relief under the CARES Act, for example. So I highly encourage everybody who's watching here and is interested in learning more about these themes to look on our website. I believe that Emma just posted a link in the chat. So you're welcome to, I encourage you to access it, and you'll see a lot more of the work that we've been doing related to COVID.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to mush into one because I think the answer might be similar. So one question is, how do you decide on what you will research? And then another question is from an undergraduate student who would like to get involved with migration research specifically, asking where he or she can start, and can we describe our paths to becoming a researcher in the field? So I think both of those questions kind of go along together. What questions do we ask? How do we get involved in research? How do we decide on a topic, and how do we get involved? Ricardo.
Yeah, so I think I had kind of previously hinted at this idea, but I think a lot of the research topics, research themes, certainly for academics, my interest in immigration, it comes from kind of a personal place, right? So I am the son of a Mexican immigrant. A lot of, might be unsurprised to find that a lot of my research has to do with Mexican migration. And I think that's a pretty common phenomenon, certainly in academia, that people often study topics that are near and dear to their heart, that they have some personal connection with. In terms of my kind of pathway into becoming a sociologist, I actually started as an undergrad as a math major, and I think I took Calculus 3 and I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. It was no longer fun, but at the same time I was taking Calculus 3, I was taking a introduction to sociology, or like a social problems class. And in that class, my instructor did an amazing job of pairing sociological theory with empirical evidence. And we had a lot of hands-on experience working with data sets. So I kind of was able to see, like, this is a very interesting and fun way to apply my knowledge of math. From there, I actually jumped at an opportunity to work as a researcher for my undergraduate university survey center. So for 3 years, I worked as both a caller and the student director of our research center, our survey research center. And through that work, I got a lot of hands-on, firsthand experience, again, collecting data and then actually analyzing and presenting data. So that, I think, only further cultivated my interest in sociological research. In terms of specific actions that I think undergraduates can take and that I always encourage undergraduates to take if they're interested in research is find faculty at your university that are studying topics or content that you're really interested in. So obviously migration research is very broad. There's tons of different ways to study migration or immigration. Different disciplines do it with different methods, with different frameworks. Find a faculty at your university that is studying migration in a way that you think is particularly interesting, and reach out to them and see if they have any ongoing projects that they could use assistance with. I think, worst case scenario, they'll say no, they got nothing going on. Best case scenario, they'll invite you on to help with a project. And I think that's a really good way to get your foot in the door and get some firsthand experience with research.
So in terms of deciding research questions, I mean, as I mentioned before, we work very closely with Catholic organizations at CMS in order to sort of determine what topics are the most pressing and what types of research would be the most valuable to them. I think in general, personally, prior to my arrival at CMS, I also thought about research in terms of what types of research will make an impact and potentially help migrants. And in academia, of course, there's an incentive to sort of publish something to pursue a line of inquiry that hasn't been researched to death already. So the more original that you can be, the better it is. And I think that's sort of a good modus operandi in general. In terms of my path to immigration research, I mean, it's a little bit different, I think. So I did a Fulbright in Turkey years ago, and I became really interested in refugee flows and also labor migration from Turkey to Europe at the time. And that led me to apply for immigration-related jobs in the US, and I got a job working at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas as a research analyst focusing on the border and the impact of immigration on the economy of Texas as well as the Southwest more generally. So that's sort of the path that I took, and I've done a few internships here and there with the State Department that touched on migration, and also with several think tanks, Migration Policy Institute, as well as a consulting gig with the Center for American Progress while I was in graduate school. So I mean, my advice to undergrads would be not only to pursue research at your university, but also to seek out these external opportunities where you'll be able to get your feet wet in sort of the policy sphere, and that'll help you understand what kinds of issues people are thinking about, not only in the research sphere, but also in the policy sphere. And then you'll be able to make an informed decision about where your passions really lie, where your goals lie, and what types of, whether you view yourself going down an academic path, whether you view yourself going more into policy research or something else entirely. So, I mean, we have I have to make this plug, we have internships at CMS, so, if any of you are undergrads and would be interested, we encourage you to apply, and we have periodic other roles that come up at CMS as well.
I'd like to apply for an internship. Monsignor, did you have something to contribute to this question?
Yes, again, I just encourage you also to listen to what the people are experiencing, which I know you do. But just to go back to COVID, I'm hearing both from our Jordan, our Lebanon office, and from people in India that we're in touch with a lot, that there's an increasing number of parents who are forcing even earlier marriages of their daughters because of the COVID situation and the impact on the economy. So I think that that's an area that we need to really look at and study and see, is that just what they've heard a few times, or is there a real trend in this area? And then look at what kind of advocacy we need to do to try to prevent that situation. And then similarly on the COVID, the internal migrants in India, there were, hundreds of thousands who were hundreds of millions who were discharged summarily when there was a lockdown. They had no way of going back to their families or their homes. They certainly weren't having any remittances to send back there either. And the church was very much involved in finding a place for them to stay, giving them something to eat, and then seeing if they could find travel money for them to get home. Again, what kind of policies do we need to put into place so that even public health measures are not, taking away even basic dignity and rights from people?
Great, thank you. And I think that answers one of the questions that's been here about how do we integrate data and the lived experiences of migrants. Like, I think you've been responding to that really, really well all throughout this panel. There is one other question. We apparently have a lot of academics on this panel as participants, excuse me. Do we believe that the growing precarity of permanent employment in academia affords us more freedom as far as investigating immigrants' rights? Or is this an ethical dilemma about whether or not we should encourage students to pursue PhDs in order to study this topic? Mike, you're laughing. Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question one more time, just so I have?
Yeah, so basically, given how apparently many of our universities are shutting down.
Yeah.
And I would say, just for those participants who aren't aware of this, academia overall is very oversaturated with PhDs right now. And so that oversaturation is just being exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic that we're having that is putting increased pressure on universities. So within this context, because of the, we can either view that as a constriction on academic freedom or as a release, I think is the intention of the question. So do you think that given this increasingly precarious future of academia as a job career, do immigrant topic researchers have more freedom or less freedom?
So this is a little bit of a challenge to answer in the sense that different fields have different sort of reward structures in place and different, I guess, the types of research and the amount of freedom they allow in choosing research topics it varies, according to fields, according to universities, according to whether you have tenure or you don't have tenure, and also whether you're in sort of a small liberal arts college versus a large research R1 university. So I don't feel like I can answer this very well in terms of, for those who are already on the tenure track. However, I think for PhD students, I think it's vital that those of you who are in academia, don't, or I guess start preparing people for the possibility of working in non-academic environments. There's a lot of good, particularly in an area like immigration, that people can do outside of the traditional university system. International organizations, think tanks, etc. hire researchers. They need people with the skills that PhDs bring. So I think it's important. I think that there's often a lot of pressure within academia, to pursue an academic career. And I think that, for many people, it's becoming less and less of a feasible trajectory. So I think that, something you can do is encourage your students to build up these skill sets and gain experiences that would be useful to them if they pursue non-academic trajectories, and maybe talk them through what their different options are, and work against this. I think it's important, and I'm gonna make a controversial statement here, but I think there needs to be a collaborative effort to destigmatize leaving academia, because it still is stigmatized in certain schools and certain faculties, and I think that's something that we can each play a part in, and that might encourage people to search out more job options where they can make a very real and important impact on people's lives.
Ricardo, do you have anything to add to that? I would just say, so as long as we're on the controversial statement, I'll just jump on the bandwagon. I think that academia is set up as a very poor structure, very poor life structure. I've had colleagues that referred to academia as a toxic relationship. And so I would encourage people who are interested in pursuing a PhD and in doing research to not, like Mike said, not buy into this idea that you have to stay in academia and that you have to play by the rules that have been set out by academia, which is this very long, it's an institution with a very, very long history that, much like the rest of our society, has been exclusively set up for a very small population to win. And so if we think about that within the context of migration and immigration and refugees, these are very vulnerable populations that are working to survive within a system in which a very small portion is destined to win, and migrants are not included in that population. So granted, academia is not the same, right? It's not a life or death situation. But if there's something that you're passionate about and there's something and you really do want to make a difference, then I would say, do it, right? Worrying about playing by the rules of an ingrained institution is what has created a lot of the problems and maintained a lot of the problems that we have today. And so if you really do want these advanced research methods that you can only get through a PhD program, by all means, please do go for a PhD. And then, like Mike said, don't feel pressured to stay within academia, and make sure that you're working on the questions and the topics that interest you most by following researchers that have already started down that path, by talking to service providers who have that direct relationship with the populations that you're interested in, so that you know that you actually know what it is that you are getting into, and that the work that you are doing can make a concrete difference in these populations that you want to help. So kind of along that, I have a question to start to close out the panel, and we have 7 minutes left, it looks like. So I'll ask each of you to respond slightly briefly, though. So this panel is about bridging research and service providers, bringing research to bear on the needs of the church. In a perfect world, what does this bridging, what does this relationship, what does this co-equal relationship look like? Msgr, and I'll have you answer first, please.
Okay, well, just to go back to what I said at the opening, I think the research helps us to get credible information, basic evidence and data that could inform the church, both in terms of the service that it gives, but also could inform the church in terms of its shaping the values and the activities and the beliefs of the people who have or are part of the church, who are adherents in that church structure, but much more widely, especially I think with the Catholic Church, because we have both a state situation where we can be present at the United Nations as another state and make statements on that basis, but then also just in terms of the involvement that the Catholic Church and the media coverage that the Catholic Church has, whether for bad or for good, in terms of the rest of the world. So many people of goodwill would also listen to some of the messages, especially of our present Pope.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, so I think that ideally, as Kiku mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, there's a lot of siloing between people who work directly, Catholic agencies that work directly with immigrants and researchers in many cases. I mean, it's not always the case, but I think that ideally there would be a lot more opportunities for collaboration, discussion, understanding what research needs are, understanding what policy topics are pressing, how researchers can contribute to their advocacy efforts as well as public education efforts. You know, and I think that's something that CMS is trying to create these spaces more and more. We're creating a network of scholars that work at the intersection of, you know, studying Catholic institutions and studying immigration, so that study immigration from a Catholic perspective. So stay tuned as we develop this network. You'll be hearing, many of you will be hearing more from us about this. And, you know, we're aiming through this network and through conferences like this to create spaces for dialogue between Catholic immigrant serving institutions and agencies and researchers. And, you know, we're open to further suggestions that people have about how we can deepen these spaces and create more collaborations moving forward.
Thank you. And Ricardo.
Yeah, so I think in thinking through this question, my mind immediately jumped to the idea of these collaborations between institutions and academics, and thinking within the context of these collaborations, I think it's really important for the relationships to be kind of equal relationships, equal footing. And I think there might be, my guess is that there might be kind of this gut reaction of academics to think that they know how research should be carried out and what types of questions should be asked, how they should be pursued. And I think, again, it's important for academics in particular maybe to treat these as equal partnerships and be open to, I think, as Mike and Robert had said, so these open dialogues to, you know, kind of collectively come to, collectively develop these research projects.
Great, thank you. So those are all of the questions I have. Do any of you gentlemen have any further questions or thoughts that you would like to share with the group?
Yeah, there's one thing I forgot to mention earlier as well about making data or making our research more accessible to the public. So we publish many of our estimates online. We have a democratizing data initiative where you can see CMS estimates of undocumented populations eligible to the naturalized populations by state and by other geographies. So that might be useful for your work as well. And we're in the process of building a few other data tools that will allow people to more directly access numbers and estimates that we're creating. And we are intending as well in the future to create a few or to put on a few sort of webinars to explain how to use these data tools and how they can benefit Catholic agencies and institutions as well.
Thank you. Ricardo, do you have any parting thoughts or questions? Monsignor?
Well, just to thank you for the work that you do and the way that you've helped us at Icmc make our work hopefully better and also more future looking. So thanks very much.
Okay, so with that, thank you very much to our panelists and to all of our participants. I would like to reiterate the question that I posed to all of you earlier, and we all would love as researchers to hear how can we help you? How can we facilitate these connections? What kind of information do you need? How can we work to get these equal partnerships and relationships going on a much broader scale so that we really can help the work that you all are doing? And thank you for that work, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.